Hi, my name is Lillian Carter. I'm 27 years old, and this is my real story. People often think that family is supposed to be your safe place, the people who protect you no matter what. I used to believe that too until the day I discovered that the very people I trusted most had been keeping a secret that would destroy my life, my future, and everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and blood. What happened to me isn't just betrayal, it's the kind of thing you see in crime shows and think that can't happen in real life, but it did, and it happened to me. It started with a single strange phone call one afternoon that made me question everything. That phone call set off a chain reaction that would lead me into a dark web of lies, manipulation, and cruelty within my own family, and before I knew it, I wasn't just fighting to protect my dignity. I was fighting to survive. If you're watching this, please like, subscribe, and share the story so more people can hear it. This story is written and edited by Dark Life Side Diaries. The first time I realized something was wrong was on a Thursday afternoon in late October when the air outside smelled like burning leaves and the sun dipped behind the tall oaks that lined our driveway. I was sitting in my small home office working on a freelance graphic design project when my phone lit up with an unknown number. Normally, I don't answer those, but something about it made me pause. I picked up and a woman's voice, trembling but sharp, said, "Lillian, you don't know me, but you need to check your father's bank records." Before I could ask who she was or what she meant, she hung up. My heart raced. My father, Robert Carter, had always been a pillar in our small town in Virginia, a respected businessman, a man everyone greeted with smiles at the grocery store. I never questioned his integrity, but that phone call planted a seed of suspicion that wouldn't let me rest. I told myself it was probably a scam, but I couldn't focus on my work. An hour later, curiosity got the better of me, and I drove to my parents' house, a sprawling two-story colonial with perfectly trimmed hedges and a wraparound porch that always smelled faintly of my mother's lavender air freshener. My mother, Evelyn, was in the kitchen arranging flowers, her smile a little too practiced. "Dad home?" I asked casually, and she said, "No, he was at a business dinner." I decided to poke around his study while she was busy. That's when I found an open manila folder on his desk, half hidden under a pile of papers. Inside were bank statements that didn't make sense. Large transfers to an account I didn't recognize, amounts in the tens of thousands, sometimes more. At the bottom of one statement, a name jumped out at me, Claire Whitmore. I'd never heard of her, but the way the transfers repeated every month, steady as clockwork, sent a chill through me. It wasn't just one or two payments, it was years worth. I shoved the papers back into the folder, but my hands were shaking. My parents had always been secretive about money, but this felt like a whole other level. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that woman's voice, and the name Claire Whitmore played in my head like a haunting refrain. By midnight, I pulled out my laptop and started searching. After an hour, I found her, a woman in her mid-40s living in a small town 2 hours away. Her Facebook profile was public enough for me to see she had a daughter, maybe 16, with dark hair and eyes that looked familiar. Too familiar. My stomach turned as the thought formed. Could she be connected to my father? The next day, I decided to drive out there. I told no one where I was going. When I arrived at Claire's modest brick house, my heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. I knocked on the door, and when she opened it, her expression shifted instantly from polite curiosity to guarded recognition. "You must be Lillian," she said quietly, as if she'd been expecting me. We sat at her kitchen table, the smell of coffee and cinnamon rolls filling the air, but I couldn't taste anything. "Claire, didn't waste time. I'm going to tell you the truth. Your mother has been hiding from you for years," she said. "Your father has another family, me and our daughter Hannah." The words hit me like a physical blow. I wanted to deny it, to call her a liar, but when Hannah came into the kitchen and I looked at her face, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile, I felt like I was staring at a younger version of myself. My mind spun. Claire told me she and my father had been together for nearly 2 decades. He had promised her he would leave my mother, but never did. Instead, he kept them in the shadows, sending money every month while playing the perfect husband and father with us. I drove home in a daze, replaying every memory of my father, every family holiday, every word he'd ever said about loyalty and honor, and it all felt like a cruel joke. But the betrayal wasn't just about him. When I confronted my mother that evening, her face went pale, and then to my shock, she admitted she'd known for years. "It was better this way," she said coldly. "We kept the peace, we kept our life intact." My chest tightened with a mix of rage and disbelief. She'd chosen to protect her marriage instead of protecting me from this truth. That night, I packed a bag and left. I stayed with my friend Melanie for a while, but every time I tried to move on, the betrayal gnawed at me, and then 2 weeks later, things escalated. I got another call this time from Hannah. Her voice was panicked. "Something's happened to Mom," she said. "I think your father had something to do with it." I froze. "My father violent?" "No, he was many things, but I never imagined him as dangerous." Still, I drove back to Claire's town immediately. The scene was chaos, police cars, outside neighbors whispering. Claire was in the hospital with a broken arm and a concussion. According to Hannah, someone had broken into their home in the middle of the night. Nothing was stolen, but the intruder had targeted Claire specifically. She believed my father had sent someone to scare her into silence. When I confronted him, he laughed, a low, cold sound I didn't recognize. "You don't understand the world, Lillian," he said. "Sometimes you have to do ugly things to protect what's yours." That was the moment I realized I couldn't just walk away from this. I had to fight back. But fighting my father meant going against not just him, but my entire family, and I had no idea how dark and dangerous that fight was about to get. I didn't sleep for 3 days after that confrontation, my mind replaying my father's words over and over like a sinister mantra, each syllable laced with arrogance and threat. I kept thinking about Hannah's terrified voice, Claire lying in that hospital bed, and my mother's icy admission that she'd known everything. The anger in me had evolved into something sharper, colder, a kind of resolve I never felt before. I wasn't going to be the quiet daughter who swallowed the lies to keep the peace. I was going to make them regret every single thing they had done to me and to the sister I hadn't even known existed. My first step was gathering proof. If my father had been funneling money to Claire for years, there had to be records. I still had photos of the bank statements I'd seen on his desk, but I needed more, something that would hold up if things got ugly, which I knew they would. I reached out to a former classmate, Aaron, who worked in IT security for a local bank. I told him just enough to pique his curiosity without giving away too much. "This might get you in trouble," I warned him, and he smirked. "Trouble's my middle name?" Within a week, he handed me a USB drive filled with years of financial records. Proof of the payments to Claire, but also transfers to other names I didn't recognize. That's when things got interesting. The other names were tied to offshore accounts, some in the Cayman Islands, others in Switzerland. The amounts were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. My father wasn't just living a double life. He was hiding money. I didn't know if it was tax evasion, fraud, or something even worse, but I knew one thing: he couldn't have done it without help. That's when my focus shifted to my mother. Her cold detachment when I confronted her had been strange, but now it made sense. She wasn't just complicit, she was benefiting from it. I remembered the luxury vacations, the designer clothes, the new Lexus she bought. After saving for years, lies, it was all funded by whatever scheme they were running together. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had to hit them where it hurt the most: their money, their reputation, and their control. But going to the police right away wasn't an option. My father's influence in our town was deep. Half the police force played golf with him, and the other half owed him favors. If I went straight to the authorities without airtight proof in a public plan, it would be my word against his, and I'd lose. That's when I decided to play a long game. My first move was to get closer to Hannah. She was cautious at first, unsure if she could trust me, but once she saw I was serious about helping her and her mother, she began to open up. She told me about late-night calls my father made to Claire, the way he controlled the amount of money she could spend, and how he threatened to cut them off if Claire caused problems. But Hannah also had something I didn't access to. Claire's old emails. Buried in them were messages from my father, not just to Claire, but to other women, some of which included explicit threats and instructions about moving money. That was the crack I needed. I printed everything, cataloged it, and stored it in 3 separate safe locations: my apartment, Melanie's attic, and a safety deposit box in a neighboring city under a fake name. If my father tried to silence me, I wanted insurance. My second move was more dangerous. I decided to infiltrate his business. My father owned a construction company that handled big contracts for government buildings, schools, and private estates. It was the perfect cover for money laundering large sums, easy to hide in materials and labor costs. I knew I couldn't just walk in and ask for a job, so I created a fake online identity posing as a freelance accountant with experience in project budgeting. Through a contact I found on LinkedIn, I got myself subcontracted for one of their projects. It was risky. One slip and he'd recognize me, but I wore wigs, glasses, and kept interactions minimal. From behind my new identity, I started combing through their project books. That's when I uncovered something that made my blood run cold. Not only were they laundering money, but some of their projects were tied to shell companies that existed only on paper. One of those companies, registered in my mother's maiden name, had received over $2 million in the past 3 years. I was holding dynamite I just had to decide when to light the fuse, but while I was gathering all this, my father must have sensed that something was off because strange things started happening one night as I was driving home. A black SUV followed me for miles before speeding past and disappearing. A week later, my apartment door was found ajar when I came home from the grocery store, but nothing was taken. A message, not a robbery. Then late one evening, Melanie's car was keyed while parked in my driveway. I knew exactly who was behind it, but without proof I couldn't call the cops. Instead, I doubled down. I started leaking small damaging rumors about my father to people in his business circle. Whispers about financial mismanagement, unsafe work practices, unpaid debts. At first, I wasn't sure it would stick, but soon I heard from Aaron that several contractors were looking into my father's company before signing new deals. I could feel the cracks forming. Meanwhile, I was building a bridge between Hannah and myself, making sure she knew she had me to rely on. I didn't want her to feel as alone as I had. But then something happened that pushed everything into overdrive. Claire's house caught fire. Thankfully, she and Hannah weren't home, but the blaze destroyed almost everything. The fire department said it looked accidental, but Hannah and I knew better. This was escalation. My father was tightening his grip, sending a clear message to stop digging. That night, Hannah called me in tears and I made her a promise. We're going to end this, and when we do, they'll never see it coming. Over the next month, I worked quietly piecing together every thread of his crimes. I found evidence of tax evasion, bribery, and even fraud involving a federal contract. Every time I got a new piece, I sent an anonymous tip to a journalist I knew from college, someone who hated corruption as much as I did. She started digging on her end, connecting dots. I hadn't even seen the tension at home for my parents was palpable, though I wasn't living there anymore. My father was jumpy, irritable, canceling trips, and holding late-night meetings that I suspected were panic sessions with his partners. My mother, on the other hand, was doubling down on public appearances, attending charity galas, and plastering on that perfect smile as if pretending nothing was wrong would make it true. They didn't know the storm was already on its way. By mid-December, the journalist called me and said, "Lillian, I think we've got enough to bury them, but once this goes live, it's going to be war." I told her I was ready. But before we could publish, something happened that almost ruined everything and put my life in danger in a way I hadn't anticipated. 3 nights before the story was set to go live, I woke up to the sound of glass shattering in my apartment. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone and crept toward the noise, but before I could even reach the kitchen, I felt a sudden blow to the back of my head. I hit the floor hard, my phone skittering out of reach, and my vision blurred through the haze. I saw a dark figure looming over me, face obscured by a ski mask. He didn't say a word. He just grabbed my wrists, zip-tied them, and yanked me to my feet. Panic surged through me, but so did anger. I knew exactly who had sent him. He dragged me out of my apartment, down the stairwell, and to a waiting van parked in the alley. My thoughts were a whirlwind of worst-case scenarios, but I forced myself to stay sharp. If this was my father's doing, he wouldn't kill me outright. He'd want to scare me into submission, maybe make me disappear for while the van drove for what felt like forever, weaving through back roads until we stopped at what looked like an old storage facility. The masked man shoved me inside a dimly lit unit reeking of mildew and zip-tied my ankles before locking the door behind him. My heart was hammering, but I forced myself to breathe. I remembered something Aaron had once told me about cheap zip ties. If you twist and pull hard enough at the locking mechanism, they can snap. It took me almost 20 minutes. My wrists raw and aching, but finally they gave way. My ankles were harder, but I managed to free myself. I pressed my ear to the door and heard nothing, so I took a chance and pushed it. It creaked open. Outside, the night air was freezing and the van was gone. I ran, not knowing where I was going, until I saw the faint glow of a gas station sign in the distance. The clerk gave me a look when I stumbled and bruised and bleeding, but he didn't ask questions, just let me use the phone. I called Melanie, and within an hour she was there, her face pale with shock. "We need to call the cops," she said. But I shook my head. Without proof of who had sent him, it would be my word against theirs, and if my father caught wind that I'd gone to the police, he'd bury me in ways I couldn't even imagine. Instead, I told her, "This changes nothing. If anything, it means we're close to breaking them." The next morning, I contacted the journalist Jenna and told her what had happened. She was furious, and she didn't mince words. "Lillian, this isn't just corruption anymore. They're dangerous." I already knew that, but hearing it from someone else lit a fire under me. We decided to accelerate the timeline instead of waiting until after the holidays. The story would go live in 48 hours. In the meantime, I doubled down on making sure I had leverage. I reached out to one of my father's former employees, a site manager named Carlos, who had been fired 2 years earlier under suspicious circumstances. It took some convincing, but eventually he opened up telling me about accidents on job sites that were covered up, inspectors who were bribed, and a file he kept his insurance photos, emails, invoices. He sent me copies. And when I saw the details, I knew they were the missing pieces we needed. The day before the article was set to publish, I got a call from my mother. Her voice was cold, but there was something almost desperate underneath. "Stop this, Lillian." She said, "You think you're going to ruin him, but you're wrong. You'll ruin yourself too." I asked her what she meant, and she said something that made my stomach twist. "You're not as innocent as you think. You've benefited from this family's money your whole life. That makes you part of it." For a second I faltered. Was she right? Had I turned a blind eye without realizing it? But then I remembered the fear in Hannah's eyes, the bruises on Claire's face, the fire that destroyed their home, and I knew the truth. I was a victim, not a co-conspirator. Still, her words lingered in my mind that night as I lay awake listening for any sound outside my window. The morning this story went live, I woke to my phone buzzing nonstop. Texts, missed calls, voicemails, everyone I knew had seen it. The headline was brutal. Local business icon Robert Carter accused of fraud, bribery, and money laundering, an explosive investigation. The article was over 5,000 words long, packed with documents, quotes, and timelines. My father's face was splashed across every local news site, and by noon regional TV stations were covering it. I watched the news footage in a daze, my coffee growing cold in my hands. Reporters camped outside my parents' house, neighbors whispered on sidewalks, and the once respected Carter name was now synonymous with corruption. But instead of satisfaction, I felt something unexpected: fear, because I knew my father wouldn't go down quietly. That night, my fear was confirmed as I was leaving Jenna's office after a follow-up meeting. A car swerved toward me in the parking lot, missing me by inches. The driver's face was hidden, but I caught a glimpse of a familiar ring on his hand. The gold signet my father always wore. It wasn't just a warning this time. It was a declaration of war. One called Hannah and told her to stay somewhere safe, and she said she was already at a friend's house. But then she added something that made my blood run cold. "Lillian, I think he's looking for you." I didn't go home that night. Instead, I stayed in a motel 2 towns over, my laptop open as I worked on a backup plan if my father tried to disappear me or silence me permanently. I wanted the rest of the evidence to hit the internet instantly. I set up timed emails with files attached, scheduled to send to multiple journalists, lawyers, and even a few politicians if I didn't check in every 12 hours. It was a last resort safety net, but it gave me a sliver of control in a situation that felt increasingly dangerous over the next few days. The fallout from the article was brutal. Contracts were canceled, banks froze accounts, and several of my father's associates were subpoenaed, but my parents didn't make any public statements. Instead, they vanished from the public eye, retreating behind the gates of our family estate. I knew they were plotting something, and that terrified me more than anything. Then a week later, I got the call that would change everything and set the stage for the final strike. It was Hannah, her voice shaking. "Lillian, they've taken Mom." When Hannah's trembling voice told me they'd taken her mother, the air left my lungs like I'd been punched. I didn't ask who they were. I knew. My father and his circle had been backed into a corner, and now they were striking where it would hurt me the most. I forced Hannah to stay on the line as she explained that 2 men in dark jackets had grabbed Claire outside the grocery store, shoved her into a van, and sped off before anyone could get a plate number. Panic clawed at me, but I couldn't let it show. Hannah was barely holding it together. I told her to go to Melanie's and lock the doors, and that I'd handle it. My first call was to Carlos, the ex-employee who'd given me the damning files. He didn't hesitate. "Meet me in 30 minutes. I think I know where they'd take her." We met at an abandoned lumber yard outside town, the kind of place that had been empty for years but still reeked of sawdust and oil. Carlos said my father used it as a quiet meeting spot when he didn't want prying eyes, which told me exactly what kind of business had gone down there. My hand shook as I loaded the small pistol Melanie had insisted I keep after the break-in at my apartment. I hated guns, but tonight hating one wouldn't stop the men who'd already shown they were willing to hurt anyone to protect my father. We drove separately to avoid drawing attention, parking in the shadows just outside the rusted fence. The place was dark except for a single light glowing inside one of the warehouses. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to move. We slipped in through a side door. The smell of damp wood and gasoline thickened the air. Voices echoed from the far end of the warehouse, and I followed them until I could see the scene through a gap in the stacked lumber. Claire tied to a chair, a bruise blooming across her cheek. Two men I didn't recognize standing guard. And sitting across from her, my father, he looked calm, almost bored as he spoke. "You've caused enough trouble, Claire. This ends now." Every muscle in my body screamed to rush in, but Carlos grabbed my arm, whispering, "We need to be smart. If we go in guns blazing, we'll both end up dead." He was right, but every second felt like an hour. Then I remembered something the small mic Jenna had given me after the kidnapping attempt. Just in case, I slipped it from my pocket, hit record, and moved closer until I could hear every word my father went on about loose ends and making problems disappear, his voice dripping with the arrogance of a man who'd always gotten away with everything. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "If Lillian doesn't stop, she'd end up just like you." That was it, the proof I needed to tie him directly to threats of violence. I nodded to Carlos, and he quietly called a contact of his, not the local cops, but a federal agent he knew from years back, who'd been looking for a way to nail my father. "Give us 20 minutes, the agent said. "Don't do anything until we're there." 20 minutes felt impossible, but we stayed hidden, my hands clenched so tightly around the pistol my knuckles went white. Then one of the guards stepped away to take a call, leaving the other distracted. Carlos whispered. Now we moved fast. He took the guard. I cut the ropes around Claire's wrist. She was weak but conscious, whispering, "He'll kill you for this." I told her, "Not if I kill his empire first." Before my father could react, the warehouse doors burst open and a team of agents swarmed in, shouting orders. Guards dropped their weapons and my father's face twisted from smug confidence to pure rage as they cuffed him. "You think this will stop me?" He spat at me as they led him away. "You're nothing without this family." I stared him down and said, "I'm better off without it." That night was a blur of statements, evidence handovers, and watching years of fear and manipulation finally start to crumble. The mic recording the financial records, Carlos's files, it was all enough to not only charge my father with multiple federal crimes, but also implicate my mother, who was arrested 2 days later for her role in laundering the money. The news exploded bigger than the first story, and for the first time, the town saw the Carters for what they really were. But the victory was bittersweet. Hannah and Claire had to move far away for safety, starting over from scratch. I stayed behind not because I wanted to, but because I needed to see the destruction through. Over the next year, I testified in court, endured threats from my father's remaining allies, and rebuilt my own life piece by piece. My parents were both sentenced to decades in prison, their assets seized, their reputations obliterated. Standing in that courtroom, hearing the verdict, I felt a mix of relief and grief. Relief that it was over, grief for the family I thought I had, but never really did. I learned that sometimes revenge isn't about rage or payback. It's about survival, about making sure the people who hurt you can never hurt you again. And when I walked out of that courthouse into the crisp autumn air, I knew one thing for sure: I'd never be silent again. Thanks for watching this video. Please like, subscribe, and share.